Now there is a shallow social gospel sort of reading of Luke 14 verses 7 through 11 that sees here merely lessons in table manners. And when I say table manners, I ought at the start to explain first of all the table. The table in those days and in that land was low. You didn't sit at it on a chair, you reclined at it on a bench. Low is the table and U-shaped, like a horseshoe, we could say. The diner then, or the host, would recline at the center or bottom of the U. You think of the U like that, and he's there at the center, so that he has people on his left and people on his right. The guests are then arranged along the two sides of the U, with his best friends and most honourable guests closest to him, nearer the centre or bottom of the U, with the less favoured and less highly esteemed guests at the two ends of the U, that is, further away from the host and the more honourable guests. And then we see the unseemly grab for preeminence, as the Pharisees and the lawyers forget themselves as they seek to get the best seats. They're not watching Jesus now. One sin drives out another sin, but Jesus is watching them. Verse 7. Christ put forth a parable to those which were bidden or invited, when he marked or noted how they chose out the chief rooms or best seats. And if we take verses 8 and 9 to apply simply to dining etiquette, these verses then would tell us what not to do when invited out, and especially if we assume that there are no place markers indicating where everyone is to sit. Do not, and this is very simple, do not grab the best seats, because if a more highly esteemed guest arrives, then three very unpleasant and embarrassing things happen. First of all, the host, with that guest in tow, approaches you and whispers in your ear, "You're in too elevated a seat." And you gulp, and you go red, and everybody else turns their heads and looks at you, understands what's happening here. After that, you have an interminably long walk of shame further and further down one of the arms of the U-shaped table. And then third, you sit mortified in the very lowest seat, even lower than you would have gotten had you not overreached yourself. And I don't know about you, but I think I can feel the shame and embarrassment of the poor, foolish soul who climbed up the social rankings in his pride and had to do a serious climb down. And you would imagine that if a man was caught out like this once, he'd make very sure that it never happened to him again. The moral then is, and it's a fair enough point, do not do this sort of thing at meals and official functions. Trying to think of a similar sort of instance, say in jumping into the front seat amongst a group that includes your superiors, or any sort of similar situation. Now verses 8 and 9 give us the negative, what you are not supposed to do. Verse 10 gives us the positive calling regarding table manners, and more especially seating arrangements. And the command here would be, sit down in the lowest seat. Then the host may invite you up higher, and you are honourably addressed as friend. Friend, come up higher. And then those present give you honour as you move near the centre or bottom of the U. And Jesus sums it up with this statement in verse 11. Negatively, whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. There are indeed lessons which can be learned here concerning table manners or etiquette, but, and you've presumably felt this too, there's more to it. We know there's more to it from several considerations. First of all, if someone chooses the lowest seat in order that at some point the host may come down, put his arm around him and move the person up, then that would be not actually humility at all, but that would be a refined and even more diabolical form of pride. That would be the person then saying, I understand how this system works. My goal is to be magnified by other people, and I'm going to take the lowest seat in the end as a means to this end, and then my ego will be stroked as I am elevated by the host and extolled by all as I climb up. And then, as the coup de grace, I will appear humble. That would be devilish. Secondly, this is probably a better argument, Jesus calls what's contained in verses 8 through 11 a parable. In verse 7 we read, he put forth a parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out for themselves the best seat. And when you hear parable, you think to yourself, kingdom of heaven. The parables are the parables of the kingdom. The parables explain the mysteries of the kingdom. The parables explain the mysteries of the kingdom because Jesus Christ came preaching the kingdom of heaven. And as part of his preaching of the kingdom of heaven, they deal with that subject, and this would point us in the direction of this parable being interpreted in that light too. And the other parables in Luke 14 are all developing some aspect of the kingdom. And the other parables in the other gospel accounts, as well as Luke, the kingdom. And the third aspect, which builds upon the last point, is that Jesus speaks here of a wedding feast in verse 8. When thou art bidden of any man to a wedding. Doesn't just refer to an ordinary meal. And when you hear wedding, in the context of the Bible, Psalm 45, which we sang earlier, and Christ's parables involving weddings, then we're moving back in the sphere of kingdom of heaven. Christ and his church. So we're dealing with more than just table manners or etiquette.